Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm happy to rise to speak on the package of bills that are before the Parliament, 12 bills, which are presented by the government as bills to abolish the carbon tax. And they do that, consistent with the position taken to the election by the Labor Party as well, but the bills do much more than that. The bills also, if passed by the Parliament, will abolish any chance of Australia having a formal legal cap on carbon pollution, any chance to move to an emissions trading scheme, which I'll address in some detail. The bills also abolish the Climate Change Authority, an independent, strong voice set up to advise the Parliament, the government and perhaps most importantly the Australian community about the very difficult and highly contested issues associated with climate change. This continues an emerging theme with this government to abolish strong independent voices and make sure that all advice to the Australian community, all advice to the Parliament is filtered through ministerial offices or, more often, the Prime Minister's office itself. The bills also abolish tax cuts or changes to the tax-free threshold established for the future, completely contrary to a promise made by the Prime Minister to keep the household assistance package put in place by Labor in full. And as the House knows, the bills also seek to abolish the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Madam Speaker, these bills represent the culmination of the most hysterical and mendacious campaign in modern Australian political history. And, Madam Speaker, it is a campaign that rests on 10 whopping falsehoods about climate change that have been peddled across this country by the Prime Minister and his fellow travellers. And in the time I have to deal with these bills, I want to deal with those 10 whoppers. Well, whopper number one, Madam Speaker, is that the jury is still out on the science of climate change. A whopper peddled by the Prime Minister right across this land over the last 4 years. As we know, the Prime Minister famously described the science of climate change as, quote, absolute crap, end quote. He only said that once. His usual formula is that the science, or as he calls it, the, quote, so-called science, end quote, is not yet settled. The member for Dawson, I read recently, said that this view represents the view of many in the coalition party room, that many in the coalition party room simply don't accept the science of climate change, or to use the language of the member for Dawson and many on the other side of the parliament, they don't believe in climate change, as if this were a question of faith rather than a question of science. Now, Madam Speaker, this is not a new perspective from those opposite. After his defenestration from the leadership of the Liberal Party, the member for Wentworth famously wrote in the Fairfax newspaper about particularly the now Prime Minister's attitude to climate change, but also that of the majority of the coalition party room. We'll remember from that article, Madam Speaker, that the member for Wentworth reflected on the views of Nick Minchin. Nick Minchin, the man who collected the numbers to do over the Liberal Party's policy on emissions trading that had been taken to the election in 2007 by then Prime Minister John Howard, and dangle those numbers in front of any candidate for the leadership willing to go with his views. Now, the now Treasurer, apparently, to his credit, resisted that temptation and stuck to his then principles of supporting an emissions trading scheme, unfortunately principles which he has since discarded. But as we know, the member for Warringah, now the Prime Minister, happily took the temptation. And the member for Wentworth wrote in Fairfax immediately after that it was Nick Minchin's view, expressed to all of the candidates, that the majority of the coalition party room simply did not believe, again using that language of faith rather than science, simply did not believe in human-induced global warming, to use the term of the member for Wentworth. Well, Madam Speaker, it is simply misleading to say that the science on this question is not settled. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued its latest report, its fifth report, in September last year. And in that, the 209 lead authors, supported by more than 600 contributing authors, lifted their level of certainty about the existence of climate change and its cause by human activity to 95%. Now, the member for Dawson complains that that's not 100%. And if coming to this place, Madam Speaker, the check-in staff at the Adelaide Airport had said that you have a 95% chance of making it from Adelaide to Canberra on your flight, then I might have declined to get onto the aeroplane. But in scientific terms, 95% certainty is seen as a gold standard. It is equivalent to the level of certainty that relevant scientists ascribe to the link between tobacco and lung cancer, But even at its highest, if it is only a 95% risk, and the member for Dawson is right to complain that it's not a 100% risk, what sensible person, what sensible member of parliament would not take reasonable action to hedge against a 95% risk, which scientists have been telling us for years, if found out, would have such significant and serious consequences? Now, Maurice Newman, the Prime Minister's senior business advisor, tells us in regular op-eds in the Australian newspaper that the IPCC, those several hundred leading climate scientists who authored the fifth report, are a fringe group. They don't represent the mainstream of scientific opinion. Well, he's simply not right about that either. This is a view that the Prime Minister has peddled as well. That hotbed of left-wing conspiracy, NASA, told us last year that some 97% of climate scientists who regularly publish in this area agree with the IPCC. Some 97% agree that the climate is changing because of human activity. Our own institutions, the Bureau of Meteorology, the CSIRO, very well, widely respected institutions, have expressed the same view on many occasions. Now, Whopping number 2, peddled by this Prime Minister, is that if there was any global warming over the course of the 20th century, it stopped. Nothing to worry about here, it stopped. Even the Prime Minister has once said that the world has actually slightly cooled since the 1990s. So if there was anything to worry about, don't worry anymore. This is something, again, peddled by Maurice Newman, the PM's leading business advisor, who wrote earlier this week in the Australian newspaper that it's actually since September 1996 that the warming has stopped. Well, again, just not true. The World Meteorological Organisation told us only some months ago that the decade of the 2000s was warmer than the 1990s, which was again warmer than the decade before it, and so it goes on as you go decade by decade back into history. NASA, over the course of the southern summer, told us that the 20 hottest years in the world on record are all since 1990, that 13 of the 14 hottest years on record are all since 2000. CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology have said time and time again exactly the same thing, that global warming continues to impact the world, continues to impact the world's oceans. In its latest State of the Climate report, their latest State of the Climate report, the Bureau and the CSIRO remind us that calendar 2013 was the hottest year ever in Australia, in spite of not being an El Niño year, which will usually see the hottest temperatures in Australia. In spite of not being an El Niño year, 2013 was the hottest calendar year ever in Australia. There were 28 days in that calendar year, 28 days that were among the 1% hottest days ever in Australia, 28 of them out of 365. That is the same number of days to get into that top 1% band in temperature for the whole 3 decades, the whole 30 years between 1910 and 1940. The world is continuing to get warmer. Now, whopper number 3 by this Prime Minister and his fellow travellers is that the Prime Minister consistently refuses to acknowledge any link between climate change and an increase in the frequency and the severity of extreme weather events, droughts, heat waves, fires, storms and more. Now, there are countless examples of the Prime Minister talking about this lack of any evidence of any link between these things, but perhaps the most unseemly example of it was the slanging match into which the Prime Minister entered with the senior official in climate change from the United Nations about the Blue Mountains bushfires, which afflicted so many communities in New South Wales last year. Now, the Prime Minister said there was no evidence about any link between extreme weather events and climate change. And I have said, as many others on our side have said, of course you cannot draw a link between climate change and any single event. But that is not what the Prime Minister said. The Prime Minister said you cannot draw a link between climate change and an increase in extreme weather events generally. And that is what conflicts with very clear scientific evidence. I remember the minister resorted to some advice from Wikipedia. I'm sure he remembers this as well, to point out that Australia has had bushfires for as long as records go back, as long as our Indigenous memory goes back, and we all know that to be the case. That is not the question. That is not the question. The question is whether there is an increase in risk, whether there is an increase in the frequency and the severity of this type of extreme weather event. And you don't need to go to Wikipedia to find out about this. You can go to our own advice from the Bureau and from the CSIRO. You can go to the Minister's own Country Fire Authority from Victoria that talks about an increase in risk, the severity and the frequency of bushfires associated with climate change. The Minister could have gone to his own departmental website that talks about a quite clearly established increase in risk of this type of extreme weather event. You could have gone to the Climate Commission's report before the government abolished it. The CSIRO and the Bureau, again in their latest State of the Climate report, published earlier this year, tracks the Forest Fire Danger Index, an index which has been tracked for many, many years here in Australia, and finds very clearly that the risk of forest fires since 1970 has risen markedly. It has risen markedly associated with climate change. It is up by 50% in the area around Melbourne Airport. The Bureau provides similar advice about the risk associated with climate change to Australia experiencing more frequent and more severe heat waves. All of this advice is quite clear, another whopper from the Prime Minister. Now, whopper number 4 from this Prime Minister and his fellow travellers, Madam Speaker, is that world leaders need not trouble themselves with this issue. They should focus on the important things like economics and security. They should leave these things to environment ministers because it's not an economic issue, it's simply a fringe environmental issue. Well, President Obama said only a short while ago, shortly before the Prime Minister's visit to the United States, that this is, and I quote, one of the most significant, if not the most significant, long-term challenge that the United States and the planet faces. The Tory Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Cameron, said that climate change is, quote, one of the most serious threats the United Kingdom and the world face, end quote. Asked about this, the Prime Minister simply said, well, I don't think so. Well, I don't think so. Blocking this from the G20 agenda has been a consistent position that Tony Abbott has taken, the Prime Minister has taken, given his position as chair. Again, as if this is not a matter for world leaders, this is simply a matter that the Minister for the Environment and his colleagues around the world should deal with. It's a fringe issue. Well, that is not the view taken by the rest of the world. Just in March, the United States and the European Union, together responsible for about half of the world's nominal GDP, signed a joint statement saying that, quote, sustainable economic growth will only be possible if we tackle climate change. This is a central economic challenge for the world's future. In February, only a short few weeks before that statement, the Premier of China, Li Keqiang, and John Kerry, the US Secretary of State, signed an expansive memorandum of understanding about the view of those two nations, the two largest economies in the world, the two largest polluters of carbon pollution in the world, that recognise, quote, the urgent need for action, end quote, leading in particularly to 2015. This month, again, Premier Li of China and David Cameron, the UK Prime Minister, signed a joint statement recognising, quote, climate change as one of the greatest global challenges that we face, end quote. And it's not just an economic challenge. President Obama has talked about the quadrennial US Defence Posture Review that is conducted every 4 years, obviously, by the Joint Chiefs of Staff there, and particularly remarked upon the fact that the Joint Chiefs had identified climate change as one of America's greatest threats to national security. But of course, why should any of that concern the members of the G20? We'll just leave it to the environment ministers. Well, whopper number 5 by this Prime Minister and the fellow travellers he travels with was enunciated in his famous trip to Canada. There the Prime Minister said, I quote again, there is no sign, he said for emphasis, that trading schemes are increasingly being adopted. Carbon trading schemes, he meant. If anything, trading schemes are being discarded. not adopted. Well, again, that is not right. The only nation that is seeking to discard a carbon trading scheme is this one, under this government. It is simply not right to say that others are doing it. I will talk a little bit more in my remarks about the position of China, but take our third largest export partner, South Korea, that introduced a few weeks ago a tax of about $20 a tonne on thermal coal imports, our third largest market for thermal coal. They are introducing a very broad emissions trading scheme on the 1st of January 2015 to add to the long list of emissions trading schemes in place among many of our oldest trading partners, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, many others, but also in many states and provinces in North America. Well, after the warm embrace of the Canadian Prime Minister, who shares the Australian Prime Minister's views on this matter, we know that the Australian Prime Minister let it be known to Australian journalists that he was going to set about building a coalition. He was going to set about building a coalition of the unwilling who would fight the Americans, who would fight the Chinese, the Europeans, the Koreans, all of those other leaders who were intent upon taking real action on climate change. He would build that coalition in partnership with the Canadian Prime Minister, and he even named the other members of the coalition. He named the New Zealand Prime Minister. He named the United Kingdom Prime Minister. The problem was, though, Acting Deputy Speaker, that he didn't actually consult with those other members of this so-called coalition of the unwilling, and we know what happened then. To the great embarrassment of the Australian Prime Minister, the New Zealand Prime Minister was forced to say at a press conference only some hours later that he was caught completely unawares by the Australian Prime Minister's announcement of his apparent membership of this coalition of the unwilling, and he restated New Zealand's commitment to taking strong action domestically on climate change, but also to being a responsible, constructive part of international progress. And I've stated a number of times the position of the UK Prime Minister. Suffice it to say that the UK government came out very quickly to say and confirm that they had no intention of being a part of the Australian Prime Minister's coalition of the unwilling. Now, Whopper number six that the Prime Minister and frankly also the Environment Minister has repeated time and time again over the last several years is that China will never take serious action on climate change and certainly would never introduce carbon trading. Perhaps the Environment Minister has not gone to the extent of saying would never introduce carbon trading, but certainly the Prime Minister has. This has been repeated by him and by many others. And I will concede that that is an important point, because China has quickly become the largest emitter of carbon dioxide, the largest polluter, to use that language, in terms of carbon dioxide pollution, in spite of the fact that it still only emits about a quarter of the carbon pollution per head of population that Australia does. In aggregate terms, obviously, being a very large country, it is now by far the biggest polluter of carbon dioxide. It has been responsible for about 2/3 of all of the growth in carbon pollution that has occurred since 2000. So I'll concede that the Prime Minister is right to be focused on what is happening in China, because it is such a significant part of what, after all, is a global problem. But again, he is just wrong. So maybe it was a reasonable position to take a few years ago, but he should admit now that he has been wrong and China has changed. Anyone who takes an interest in this area of policy will have noticed a very significant, extraordinarily significant change in policy from the Chinese leadership over the last 18 months, particularly because of the terrible, the awful air quality that particularly exists in the northern part of that country. I've talked about a number of the bilateral agreements, statements, memoranda of understanding that at a leadership level, particularly with the Premier, Li Keqiang, China has engaged in with the United Kingdom, with the European Union, and with the United States. And these are incredibly important statements of intent by China, not just to do a whole lot of things domestically, which they are doing, but also to be a leader, following the disappointment of Copenhagen, to be a leader along with the United States as the two largest economies and powers in the world, leading into the very important conference that will take place in Paris next year. Now, last week, the 7th emissions trading scheme started. The 7th emissions trading scheme started in China, some of them at provincial level, for example Guangdong, some of them at city level, starting I think in Shenzhen. with the expectation that the Chinese leadership will try to move to a national carbon trading scheme in the second half of this decade. Now, the Minister for the Environment often says, well, these permits are given away for free, and such may be the case in some of the different markets. But what is clear is that in all of those markets, the 6 that have been operating for a while, there is now a burgeoning carbon trading market. There's now a burgeoning carbon trading market. If you look at Shenzhen, for example, which I think was the first emissions trading scheme introduced in China, the price of a permit in Shenzhen is trading, or was trading last week, I haven't looked at this week's price, but was trading last week at about €8.50, equivalent to €8.50. So higher than the price at which the permits would trade on Treasury advice. The permits would trade under Labor's emissions trading scheme with a linkage to the EU scheme, higher than the price at which permits would trade under the amendments that I would be moving later in this debate. Well, Whopper number 7, Acting Deputy Speaker, is that the carbon price, the framework that the government seeks to demolish entirely, the carbon price mechanism would be a wrecking ball through the Australian economy. A wrecking ball. Now, the Prime Minister used a whole range of different colourful epithets for this. He said it would be a cobra strike at the economy. He said the South Australian town of Whyalla would simply disappear off the map. I think he made the same prediction about Gladstone, maybe some other parts of Australia as well. Well, again, the truth is entirely different. The truth of the impact was exactly as Labor predicted. Exactly as Labor predicted. The economy did keep growing. More than 160,000 additional jobs were created in the first 12 months of this carbon price mechanism that, according to the now Prime Minister, was going to deliver a wrecking ball impact on the national economy. But also what it started to do, along with our renewable energy policies, is it started to drive down carbon pollution, particularly in the electricity market, which is the largest source of carbon pollution in Australia. We saw a reduction in carbon pollution of around 7% in the NEM, the National Electricity Market, in the first 12 months. And, as we predicted, there was simply a modest impact on prices, an impact that was more than covered through our household assistance package, particularly for low-income and fixed-income households like pensioners, and also for middle-income households. The impact on power prices, again, was exactly as we predicted, and again covered by our household assistance package, particularly for low and middle-income households. Taking my own state, for example, in South Australia, power prices went up by about 4.6% as a result of the introduction of the carbon tax. If our amendments were passed to move to an emissions trading scheme, Treasury's advice to us in government was that that impact would be reduced by about 3/4. So the ETS impact on South Australian power bills would be in the order of 1.1%. 1.1%, way more than covered by the household assistance package. And to put that in context, compared to increases over the last 4 years in SA power bills of 43% because of investment in poles and wires, the network investment that has bedevilled electricity systems all around the country. Very significant gold-plating of network infrastructure that has led to very significant increases in power prices, which again the Prime Minister mendaciously tried to attach to the carbon price on many, many occasions. Well, Whopper number 8, Acting Deputy Speaker, Whopper number 8 was the Prime Minister's statement to Alan Jones earlier this year that the renewable energy targets, I quote the Prime Minister, are significantly driving up power prices right now, end quote. Well, again, that is simply wrong. And report after report released recently has put the untruth, I was going to use some other word, put the untruth to that statement, Acting Deputy Speaker. The renewable energy policies that the Labor Party put in place over the last several years have been an unambiguous success. They have seen renewable energy capacity expand significantly. Wind power tripled under our time in government. We saw a position of 7,500 households having PV solar panels when we came to government to more than 1.1 million households having solar panels, getting out of the power race, getting out of the power bill trap, creating their own power and relieving enormous pressure on the grid, particularly in those parts of Australia that are impacted by heat waves. We saw the tripling of job numbers in the renewable energy sector. We saw billions of dollars come into this sector in investment, to the point where, by the middle of last year, Australia was rated, along with the powerhouses in this area, China, Germany and the US, Australia was rated as one of the 4 most attractive places in the world to invest in renewable energy. It's no surprise that since the election of the new government, in that index, Australia has slipped a couple of places every quarter. I think it's now about 8th in the world, from a position of being at 4th. This has been an extraordinary success. It does, as every renewable energy program in the world, and there are dozens and dozens, it does have a modest upfront cost, but it also has a swing and roundabout benefit in the sense that it is suppressing wholesale power prices. It is suppressing wholesale power prices, particularly at those peaky times of power during heat waves, when power might be sold for thousands and thousands of dollars, particularly in the southeast of Australia. Those prices have been diminished by as much as 90%, in those peaky times, which flows through to consumers. Now, I mentioned some reports that have been clear about this. The Rome consultancy report that was released, I think, a month or 2 ago, the Bloomberg New Energy Finance report that was released a few weeks after that, but even ACIL Allen's report, the consultancy engaged by the government as part of its renewable energy target review, has confirmed that prices will go up if the renewable energy target is removed, because that suppression effect on wholesale power prices will be removed and consumers will be exposed to the almost certain increase in gas prices that we're going to see as the LNG capacity comes on in Gladstone. Now, whopper number 9, Acting Deputy Speaker, is that the government's direct action policy will achieve the bipartisan minimum target to reduce carbon pollution by 5% by 2020. Well, there is not one serious commentator that agrees with this whopper. Not one serious commentator. It's a whopper that has been repeated by the Prime Minister and by the Minister for the Environment for 4 straight years with a straight face. And I commend them for that, because there is not a serious commentator that agrees with them. Madam Acting Deputy Speaker, I had the opportunity to address this at length in a debate yesterday, and I don't propose to go through that again, except to say that only the most recent report about this from Reputex, a very expert modelling firm that works in this area, they reported that the direct action policy would fall about 70% short of the target. Ken Henry, the former Secretary of the Treasurer, reported earlier this year, confirmed earlier this year, that for the direct action policy to achieve the target, the government would have to spend between $4 and $5 billion of taxpayer dollars every single year to pay polluters to start to reduce their carbon pollution, rather than an emissions trading scheme that has the polluters pay. Now, whopper number 10. Whopper number 10 was a whopper that the Prime Minister engaged in, again in his overseas trip. It was after President Obama released his Clean Power Plan, a very significant plan to start to reduce carbon pollution in existing power plants. This follows on from the President's plan to impose emission standards or pollution standards on motor vehicles and on new power plants. This was about existing power plants, a reduction of 30% in that pollution by 2030. Now, the Prime Minister said, again with a straight face, that President Obama's plan was, quote, very similar to the actions that my government proposes to take. Well, once one gets through the laughter about that statement, Acting Deputy Speaker, you go back to the member for Wentworth, because the member for Wentworth expressed it better than I think anyone else has when he said about direct action that it is simply a fig leaf to cover a determination to do nothing. A fig leaf to cover a determination to do nothing. And, for that matter, a recipe for fiscal recklessness on a grand scale was the statement the member for Wentworth made in the debate in this place. The direct action policy has no discipline on pollution whatsoever. The so-called safeguards mechanism has been discarded by this minister, so that all you have is a dressed-up slush fund to pay taxpayers' dollars to big polluters to start to reduce their pollution. Acting Deputy Speaker, Labor's position on these bills will be of no surprise. It will be the position we enunciated clearly to the electorate in September, a position we have been advocating ever since, and that is to terminate the carbon tax now, to move to an emissions trading scheme that has a formal legal cap on carbon pollution for the first time ever in this country, for the first time ever, a cap that reduces over time and then lets business work out the cheapest and the most effective way to operate. And I foreshadow that in consideration in detail I will be moving amendments to that effect. Thank you, Acting Deputy Speaker.
I thank the member.